Hi, my name is Aditya and for my IEP video submission I have selected the topic Effects of Exchange Rate Fluctuation on the Economy. So let's begin with the definition of exchange rate. Now exchange rate is defined as the rate at which one currency can be exchanged for another. So basically it implies what the value of one currency is with respect to the other currency. Now because exchange rate is such a global phenomenon and it is used in all the major countries in the world, there are various classifications of the exchange rate. So let's get into what are the different types of exchange rates. So the first type is a floating exchange rate, which basically implies that the exchange rate is not restricted. It is not controlled by the central bank or any authority of the particular countries. This implies that the exchange rate changes based on the market. That is, if the demand or supply of the currency changes, the exchange rate of that particular currency changes. It does. The central bank cannot, or any authority cannot change the exchange rate by themselves. The other side of the spectrum is the fixed exchange rate, which basically implies that some authority of the particular country has complete control over the exchange rate. So let's say the central bank has control of the exchange rate. So the central bank controls what the exchange rate should be at every instant of time. So the example for this is Hong Kong. So $1 is exchanged for can be exchanged for 7.75 Hong Kong dollars. Now this is fixed. So if the value of US dollar changes, the value of Hong Kong dollar changes proportionately. Now in between these two, there is something called the managed exchange rate, which is an amalgamation of the two. India follows this managed exchange rate. So what is basically implies that the central bank has control over the exchange rate, but it does not exercise control until some extent. So the exchange rate is basically free to move by itself depending on the market forces till some extent. If it changes beyond that particular extent, then the central bank, that is RBI in our case, will intervene and change the exchange rate based on their speculation. Now let's move on to what are the factors that basically determine the exchange rate, right? So the first is the balance of payments. What happens is when there is a huge balance of payment the deficit by any country, the foreign exchange earnings are less than the foreign exchange expenditures. So what happens is the demand for that exchange exceeds its supply, resulting in higher exchange rates. And what basically higher exchange rate implies is a lower value or a depreciating currency. So if the exchange rate of rupee increases, the value of the rupee with respect to another currency decreases. That is what is implies here. So the other determinant is interest rate level. Now interest rate level is basically the cost of borrowing money, right? So if the cost of borrowing money is high, then the demand for the money will be low, right? So what happens is if the value of a particular exchange rate is low, then a lot of people would like to purchase that particular currency. So what happens is it draws the capital when the interest rates are low. Now because this interest rate is low, a lot of people put in money, which increases the demand, and increase in demand raises the price. So basically the value of the currency appreciates or the exchange rate depreciates. Now moving on to the third factor, which is inflation. Now because of inflation, the value of money changes, right? So what happens is when inflation increases, the purchasing power of money decreases, and along with it the foreign currency appreciates with respect to your particular currency. If both the currencies are changing, that is both the economies have inflation, then the economy with higher inflation has the lower value of the exchange rates. So let's say there is higher inflation in India with respect to the US. So then the US currency will be stronger compared to Indian currency. That is what it implies. Now moving on to fiscal and monetary policy. So what happens is because there are measures taken by the government and the RBI, sorry, not the government, the RBI, to change the fiscal and the monetary or the monetary policy of the country, it either allows or contracts the flow of money in the economy. Now this creates a demand or supply for the domestic currency, because of which the exchange rate changes. So if there is expansionary fiscal or monetary policy, it will lead to a devaluation of the currency. Now I use the word devaluation because it is done intentionally by the central bank of the country. So another factor which affects the exchange rate is venture capital. If they expect a currency to appreciate, then what they will do is they'll buy large amount of currency. Now what this will do is it will cause exchange of the currency to rise, right? So this will because the exchange rate rises, the currency depreciates. The currency appreciates. Now moving on to government intervention, what happens is a lot of times government wants to achieve its goals that it had promised to the people. For those goals to be achieved, it changes policies which change the exchange rates. Now because these policies change the exchange rate, this is also another factor that affects it. Now moving on to what are the determinants of moving on to the effects of exchange rate. One of the huge effect is inflation. So because of inflation, there is a lot of change in the import and exports of goods, which are affected by exchange rate because exports and imports are done on foreign currency. The other thing is the prices of commodities, because commodities are sold at the same price everywhere. Exchange rate plays a huge role in that. The other thing is changes in the growth of exports. Exports will increase if the exchange rate is high. That is, your currency is weak. So if an outside country can purchase your currency at a lower price, then they will probably tend to import more from you. That is, your exports will increase. Another aspect of it is the unemployment. So what happens is, because there is exchange rate appreciation, the growth of real GDP changes. Now because of this growth changes, it basically, if the exchange rate is increasing, it will lead to a lower net imports. It will lead to a lower net exports. That is, the value of exports will reduce. Now, so because of this reduction in exports, it will lead to laying off of people, which is basically unemployment. So though these effects are temporary, it has a huge impact on the current situation of the economy. This is very well determined by the expectations augmented Phillips curve, which basically tells you for what rate of inflation how much unemployment will be there. And because inflation also affects the exchange rate, it indirectly affects the unemployment as well. Now moving on to the macroeconomic benefits of a weaker currency. What happens is, because your currency is cheap, people tend to buy it. People tend to purchase more from you instead of purchasing from someone else who has a strong currency. So it leads to a higher export or increase in export. Now what happens is, this leads to a lot of businesses which export more in that particular country. This is known as the supply chain effect of exports. Now moving on, now another report by Goldman Sachs basically estimated that 1% fall in the exchange rate has the same effect on the output of United Kingdom as a 0.2% cut in interest rates. So that is an interesting fact by Goldman Sachs. Now there are also disadvantages of currency depreciation, one of which is a capital flight, which implies that venture capitalists take away money from the economy. The other effect is known as the J curve effect, which is basically that balance of trade worsens out. So your imports worsen and your exports go bad. Thank you.